Let's first talk about what exactly objections are, what we're talking about here. When you're talking with prospects, whether it's cold calling or in meetings, you're likely to face some of these. And that the prospect saying, I'm busy right now, I'm not interested, we do not have any budget or money right now, we already used someone, we're not looking at making any changes right now, just send me your information, you're too expensive, call me back in X months. So these are all very common. And in fact, you could probably add 3 or 4 to this list that are specific to your industry or your product or service. And these can be difficult. And so we're going to talk about here today how to respond to these. And these will come up again and again. So if you only do one thing, which is become more prepared for the objections that you're going to face time and time again, you will immediately improve your results. I mean, sure, the response you prepare might not always work, but to have a prepared response instead of improvising will greatly improve your overall results. And so let's talk about how to respond to these. The approach here, first, we're going to go back to some of the core concepts that we've been talking about. Then I'm going to outline 3 different objection handling options that you could use for each objection. I'll take you through a process that you can use to create your own objection responses. We'll talk about deflecting objections, overcoming objections, and then we'll wrap up with a few objection handling best practices. So let's start by going back to some of the core concepts that we've been talking about again and again. And one of the core concepts that I want to start out with is talking about how the sales process impacts your objection responses and how you respond to objections. So if we just quickly look at the sales process, starting out with some sort of initial contact, first time you're speaking, interacting with a prospect, and then at the end of the process is the prospect's decision to purchase your product. So those are the 2 bookends of the sales process. And one thing I've talked about before is that a lot of times product selling salespeople just focus more on the purchase and the decision to purchase, even if that's down the road. The product selling salesperson might communicate in a way of, this is what I sell, do you need what I sell? And one thing that I've pointed out a few times already is that there's many steps in between, and you can improve your sales results and improve what you say and ask by focusing on the steps in between these 2 bookends, because regardless what you sell, you're likely going to progress to some sort of conversation that might progress to some sort of explanation, and then that might lead to the actual decision step. And by focusing on these steps will impact everything you say and ask. And that also applies to your objection handling. So for example, if the prospect's objection is, we don't have budget right now. If you're only focused on the decision and purchase step of your sales process, that is a valid reason to not continue to move forward because they don't have budget to purchase what you sell. But if you're focused on these other steps of just having a conversation, then the fact that the prospect does not have budget is not relevant. It's almost an invalid objection. And you can respond to that with an objection response like this. The prospect says, we don't have budget right now. Oh, I understand. Listen, I'm not calling to sign you guys up for anything. I don't even know if you guys need what we sell. I was more just reaching out to open the dialogue between our 2 organizations and have a first conversation. And by the way, that way you can know who we are and how we can help, so that when your budget planning opens back up, you can have all the information you need. And if you want, you can re-engage with us at that time. And then you can be more prepared for your budget planning regarding how we can help you. So, and then you try to close for the meeting. So again, that might not work. The prospect still might not want to meet with you, but it was focusing on the conversation step in the sales process that can lead you to having that objection response. And I just said a bunch of stuff there, and you can memorize exactly what I just said, and that might help you. But the more important thing is to change your mindset to realize that you're not trying to sell anything and you're not focused on the decision step. You're focused on selling the conversation. And when you fully realize that, then you can use your own words and explain that in your own way to the prospect. And what this comes down to is basically that core concept of don't sell the product, sell the meeting. And this can greatly help your objection handling and how you handle objections. Another concept to keep in mind regarding how you handle objections and trying to figure out what to say is to focus on the goal of just trying to keep the conversation going. This is something that you have to remind yourself because your natural instinct might be to try to overcome the objection. So if the prospect says, I'm not interested, your first instinct may be to try to figure out what to say to make the prospect interested. And that is the goal of trying to overcome the objection, resolve the objection, put the objection to bed, and get it out of your way. But an easier goal and a more logical goal could be just to simply try to keep the conversation going, and we'll show you how to do that. So with all the other modules in the SMART training program, we always try to focus on understanding the prospect when figuring out how best to communicate. And this especially help you with objection objection handling because you're trying to figure out how to get around this objection or how to keep the conversation going. So by trying to understand the prospect, it can greatly impact what you say. It could also improve your ability to minimize the objections that come up. For example, let's try to understand the prospect. So why do they give us objections when we're on the phone with them or when we're trying to sell to them? So a lot of times they give you an objection because they simply want to get rid of you. They sense that you're a salesperson trying to sell something and they're just trying to end this conversation and get out of this situation. They might feel like they don't want to be sold to. I believe that a lot of us like buying stuff, but it's sometimes uncomfortable and annoying having someone sell to you and to have a salesperson try to push something on you. So they might sense that you're pushing something on them and they don't want to be sold to, so they give you an objection. And they also could think that they don't need what you are selling. So if you call up in product selling mode and you say, I sell this, they could legitimately think, well, I don't need that. I'm not interested. We already have something. And so they give you an objection that's genuinely connected with what they believe. Now, that's not to say that they don't need what you sell, and that's not to say that you can't persuade them and build interest on their side. But at the time they're talking to you, they genuinely believe that they don't need what you sell, and that's why they're giving you an objection. And one of the reasons why they might think that is that it's very likely when you reach out to prospects, they're not in buying mode for what you sell. They are doing many different things, and at the exact time that you are lucky enough to get them on the phone, they're likely not doing a search or research for what you sell. And that's just more of a statistical assumption in that, they're doing many things. So at that exact moment, they're likely not thinking about buying what you sell. And so they might give you an objection. Now, if you agree with that, and if you think that those are good assumptions, well, we can use that to our advantage in how we try to minimize the objections that we trigger. So one of the best ways to get around objections is to make changes so that you face less objections that you have to try to get around. And one of the best ways to face less objections is to decrease how much you sound like a salesperson that's trying to sell something. So for example, if you can shift more from product selling to consultative selling, and the prospect that ends up on the phone with you has less of that feeling like someone's trying to push something on me, I don't need what you sell, then you might minimize some of the objections that you face. So this is a very proactive way to decrease objections and improve how you get around objections. Now let's talk about 3 different ways that you can handle an objection that you receive. So the first one is you can comply with the objection, you can try to overcome the objection, or you could try to deflect the objection. Comply is basically the prospect gives you an objection, which is basically trying to end the conversation by telling you they don't need what you sell or they're not interested. And you basically comply with the objections. They say, we're not interested. Okay, I'm busy. Okay, so you're complying with the objection. The other option is to overcome the objection. So a quick example here would be if the prospect says, again, I'm not interested, then you try to figure out something to say to make them interested. Or if they say you're too expensive, you try to say something to ease that concern that they think that you're too expensive or to help them to understand why you're not more expensive. And the third option is to deflect the objection. So think of this as a prospect says an objection and you acknowledge it, but you try to bounce off of it in your effort to keep the conversation going. And so think of this as sort of Daniel-san in The Karate Kid or Cobra Kai, where with the wax on and the wax off. So you still have the hit coming in, but instead of it hitting you directly, you kind of brush it away and try to keep moving forward. And so we'll talk about each of these options in more detail. But the first thing to point out is that none of these are right or wrong. There's a time and place for each of these objection handling methods. The key thing is figuring out when to do each of these. So regarding comply, my rule of thumb is at some point you just need to comply. You can't just continue to try to respond and keep the prospect on the phone. I mean, at some point you're going to damage rapport. So while you might be effective at having something to say or keeping the conversation going or trying to overcome the objection or have a response for what the prospect is saying, at some point you're going to damage rapport and you might have longer phone calls, but those prospects aren't going to buy from you when they start to get annoyed and you're just wasting both parties' time. So at some point you need to comply. My rule of thumb is after you've tried to resolve an objection 2 or 3 or 4 times, if you can't get around it, then you comply with it. And it's not to say that maybe the conversation or call ends there, but maybe you ask a different question or you try to go in a different direction. But after 2 or 3 attempts of trying to overcome or deflect an objection, if the prospect still has that, you comply and accept it and move on. Now, regarding when to overcome and when to deflect, let's go back to the sales process because I think the sales process can tell us when to use each of those methods. And in a previous training module, we talked about the ICE sales process with the initial contact, conversation, and explanation. Now, a lot of the objections that you're going to face are in the initial contact step, which is when you're sending emails and when you're talking to a prospect for the first time. I personally believe that the objection handling method to use at this point is deflecting objections. So this is when you want to acknowledge them, brush them off a little bit, try to bounce off of them, and keep the conversation going. The reason why is because the initial contact is very quick and fast. So if you want to try to overcome an objection, you need a little bit of time to make your case and explain your side of it, or try to persuade the prospect to see things from a different way. And that's very challenging to do. Not to say it's impossible, but you need a little bit of time and attention to work with that. I personally think you don't have that amount of time at the initial contact step. So that's why deflecting is better. Also, you don't need to overcome objections at the initial contact step because you're not trying to sell the product. Your goal is to sell the conversation, which is the next step in the sales process. And most of the time, you don't need to resolve objections in order to sell that. If the prospect is not interested, that's okay. They're not interested in buying what you sell. That doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense to talk. The prospect is already using someone today. That's fine. That might be a reason for them not to buy from you, but it is not a reason not to sell the conversation. So the next step in the process is the conversation. And this is where I do think it makes sense to try to overcome objections. So this is where you're maybe in an appointment and a meeting with a prospect. And at this point, if the prospect says, well, we're already using someone today, and that's a showstopper, then you might try to identify if there's no way they're going to make a change, then it might not make sense to move to the explanation step and spend your valuable time explaining how you can help if they're already using someone today. So when you get the objections like we don't have budget or we're already using someone at the conversation step, that's the time to deal with it. And you usually have the time and attention to talk through that. And you can identify if it's a showstopper, or you can identify if you can resolve that objection and find reasons to continue moving forward. And that would be overcoming the objection. And then once you progress to the explanation step, of course, there you want to overcome objections as well. So the deflecting objections is primarily in the initial contact step, which, by the way, that's where you're going to spend most of your time, and that's where you're going to face most objections. And by deflecting objections, you can generate more leads, get more appointments. And then once you are engaged with these prospects, then you can focus primarily on trying to overcome objections. So let's talk about creating your objection responses. And it kind of goes back to this slide, which is what we've talked about before. So on the left side is product selling, and we've talked about that's where salespeople primarily go out. This is who I work for. This is what I sell. Do you need what I sell? Now, when product selling salespeople create their objection responses, they primarily use product information. So if a prospect says, I'm not interested, they will share more product features or details to try to make the prospect interested. And that's basically trying to overcome the objection. So typically product selling people primarily try to overcome objections. On the consultative selling side, we have a lot of really good stuff there that we can use for deflecting objections. And by using that, we can improve our ability to sort of bounce off objections and get into more appointments. And so let me show you what this looks like. It all goes back to the sales message that we created in a previous training module. We went through this process to create a sales message. Our demo sales message is web design services. And each of these steps helped us to create building blocks. We've used these building blocks to create our cold call script, our email templates. We can also use these building blocks for our objection handling responses. And what's really nice here is that if we use the same blocks for our objection responses that we use to create our cold call script, for example, we're not necessarily creating more stuff to memorize or learn in terms of responses, because all of our objection responses are already in our script. What we're basically doing is when a prospect gives us an objection, we're bouncing to different sections of our script. And so let me show you what that looks like. We'll use some of these in our deflection responses, and we'll also use some of these building blocks in our overcoming. Let's first start to talk about deflecting objections. So before I show you these objection responses, I first want to share some what I call disarming language. And I'm going to give you a few different sentences, and you can sprinkle these into your objection handling responses and use any part of this. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So the first thing that we want to do to disarm the prospect is, we've already talked about understanding the prospect in order to improve our objection handling. Well, we can actually let the prospect know that we understand them, and we can do that by actually saying, I understand. So anytime a prospect gives you an objection response, the first thing you can say as your response is, I understand. We also talked about, because we understand prospects don't like being sold to, and they get sold to a lot, and because the prospect's objection might be about them not buying from us, we want to educate them that we're actually not trying to sell anything to them, because we're not focused on that decision step and the purchase. We're focused on the conversation step. We're focused on having a conversation, and we can let them know that by saying something like, and I want you to know I'm not reaching out to you to try to sell you anything or sign you up for anything. Then we can educate them on the process that we're trying to go through. We're just looking to open the dialogue between our two companies and have an initial conversation. And then right after that, you could actually do a sales takeaway. All of this is optional. So take any of this language and add it to your objection responses that you want. But the last thing you could do is a sales takeaway to say, I don't even know if you fit well with what we provide. That can be a really good disarming tactic at the end of that you can say, and then you can add some sort of objection response after this. But if you recall earlier in this module, I gave you the no budget response, and I used a lot of this when the prospect says, we don't have budget right now. Oh, I understand. And, I'm not reaching out to sign you guys up. I'm just looking to open up the dialogue between our two companies. I don't even know right now if you guys are a good fit with what we sell. So what I just showed you there, you could add in front of any of the objection responses that I show you now. But a very common objection response is, I'm not available or I'm busy right now. Just here is a real quick option for you to maybe to add to what you're saying. But, oh, okay, I can be really brief, or I can call you back at another time. Or, oh, okay, what is the best time for me to call you back? I've personally found that when you let them know that you're going to be calling them back at another time, sometimes they just give you a couple minutes right then, and then you can kind of execute your call. The next objection is, what is this in regards to, or is this a sales call? These are very common objections, and you can sometimes face this when dealing with gatekeepers as well. But this is a question asked to try to determine, are you a salesperson trying to sell something? So the worst thing you could do is sort of directly answer this to say, well, I'm calling to schedule an appointment or trying to learn about your needs or whatnot. So what I recommend is deflect this objection back to your value points. So a prospect says, what is this in regards to? Oh, well, the reason for my call is we help small businesses to increase the revenue they generate through their website. So not necessarily saying that this resolves that objection or that the prospect will receive you with open arms after you say that, but it's a bit of a curveball. And remember, our goal here is to keep the conversation going. And so this is a good tactic to use to sort of bounce off this objection and keep the conversation going. Prospect may ask you another question after that, or then you could roll on to ask the prospect a question. For these objections, you could respond to them in the same way. So, I'm not interested. We're not making any changes. We don't have any budget right now. We already use someone right now. So one way that you could respond to these is with your pain questions. I understand. If I could ask you real quick, how important is it for you to get revenue out of your website? So you're not really addressing the fact that they're not interested. You're deflecting that and bouncing off of it by asking a question. And most of the time, you might get an answer to this question. If you've minimized how much you sound like a product selling salesperson, it's most likely not the case that the prospect will say, listen, I told you I'm not interested. Most likely they will answer in some sort of way. The answer might not be great, but there'll be some sort of answer to this question. And the way you use that is then you can follow up with a question based on their answer, or you could ask another question, or maybe the prospect gives you a great answer, and then you use their answer as a reason to close for the next step in your sales process, which is the conversation. You could also respond to those objections with your current state questions in the exact same way. We already use someone right now. Oh, I understand. If I could ask you real quick, who are you currently using? How's it going? Or do you currently have a CMS platform in place? Those same objections, you could respond with pain points. They say, I'm not interested. Oh, I understand. We work with a lot of small businesses and they often have challenges with website visitors aren't converting to customers. Are you concerned about that? You could also deflect those objections back to your sales process. And this kind of uses some of that disarming language that I shared with you before. So again, if they say, we're not making any changes right now, I understand. And I want you to know I'm not reaching out to try to sign you up or sell you anything. More so, we're just trying to open the dialogue. We'd like to learn a little bit more about you and possibly share some information about us. That way, when you begin your budget planning or you're needing to make a change, you can know who we are and how we can help. Are you open to putting a brief conversation on the calendar? It does not have to be this week or next. We're not going anywhere. So just some stuff to think about there for how you respond to those objections. Another very common objection is for prospects to say, can you send me your information? And a lot of times prospects will use this to try to get rid of you. It's very effective at getting rid of salespeople, and the prospect or the gatekeeper doesn't have to look like a bad person or hurt anybody's feelings. Oh, send me your information. And the worst thing you could do is spend 20 minutes putting together a beautiful email that, gets instantly deleted. There are times where it makes sense to send over your information. And if you can't get around this objection, you may want to send over your information. I would just say don't spend too much time putting it all together, making it look beautiful. But before you reach that point, is you could respond to this objection with your pain questions. So they say, yeah, oh yeah, well, can you just send me your information? Sure, I can do that. So I know what best to send you. Could I ask you real quick, how important is it for you to improve your website conversion rates? The prospect is likely to give some sort of answer there. You could follow up that answer with a question related to their answer or a different question, or they might give you an answer that allows you to move forward in your cold call script. So that's a way to deflect off of that. They might not even go back to their request for information. They might even just forget that they asked for that. You could respond to that in the exact same way with your current state questions. Sure, I can do that. So I know what best to send you. Could I ask you real quick, are you currently working with a web design agency? You could respond to that objection by deflecting back your close, which is trying to close for the conversation, by saying something like this. Sure, I can do that. Actually, there's a lot of information that I can send over to you. If you have some questions about anything, it might be easier and quicker just to have a brief conversation over the phone on another day instead of me sending over a bunch of information. And then here is a repeat of that disarming language, that you're not reaching out to sell them anything, just trying to open up the dialogue, would like to learn more about them. So that's a long response there. Whether or not you memorize that and use it exactly is up to you, but just trying to give you some ideas of how you could deflect. Can you send me your information? Back to trying to close for the appointment, the next step in your process. A lot of times prospects say, hey, well, call me back in 6 months. And so you could either comply with that and say, okay, and then you put a note and call them back in 6 months. But, again, before we comply, maybe we try to respond in a couple ways. So you could say something like this: I can certainly do that, but I want you to know that I'm not reaching out to you to try to sign you up or sell you anything. More so just looking to open up the dialogue. We'd like to learn a little bit more about you and possibly share some information about us. So this is the same language here, trying to start the conversation and then close for the appointment. Another response for if they say, can you call me back in 6 months? We could deflect to our pain points, which is to say something like, hey, I can certainly do that. When I talk with other small businesses, they often have challenges with website visitors aren't converting to customers. Are you concerned about that? Maybe the prospect might say something there that allows me to ask another question or go for the close. But this is just deflecting, trying to keep me alive, keep the conversation going. Now, what's really nice is if you get the call me back in X months, and this is a prospect that you've spoken to before, you can tailor this objection response to them. And that's to say something like, hey, I can certainly do that. When we spoke before, you mentioned that website visitors weren't converting as much and you had abandoned shopping carts. Are you still concerned about that? Does it make sense to not deal with that for another 6 months and come back and work on that at that point? And so maybe their response there gives you an opportunity to close for the appointment. It's worth a shot before you comply and just say, okay, and then you call them back in 6 months. Now let's talk about overcoming objections. And overcoming objections, it is a bit difficult for us to give you objection responses because the objections can be so unique for each salesperson, each product, each situation. There are some objections, though, that we can use our building blocks for, and I'll go through those real quick. So when the prospect says, we can't afford your product, it's too difficult to change right now, we'll have to come back to this later, you could reply to that by going back to your value points. Because if the prospect thinks they can't afford your product, maybe it's the case that they don't really understand how your product helps them. So educate the prospect on how your product helps them, which is to say something like, I understand. We typically help small businesses to improve website conversion rates. Would those types of improvements justify investing in this area? So you're kind of going back to the value that you have to offer because maybe the prospect doesn't understand that. Maybe they do and they still think they can't afford what you sell, but this is a way to respond to those objections, which is going back to your value points. You could also use your pain points. So for those same objections, I understand. We work with a lot of small businesses and they're having challenges with website visitors aren't converting to customers. Are you concerned about any of those? Is there any risk in waiting to deal with those areas? So the logic here is if you've identified pain points that prospects have that you can help, that your service or product can help, you can go back to that when the prospect is saying it's too difficult to change, or we have to come back to this down the road, or we can't afford you. You could also use your name drop building block for these same objections. So they say, we can't afford your product. I understand. We actually worked with an accounting firm and they needed to generate leads. To solve this, we helped them to redesign their website. This helped them to convert more traffic into leads and ultimately help them to increase their revenue they were generating through their website. If we could help you in that same way, would that justify investing in this area? So educating the prospect on how you can help by using a name drop and using that as a way to keep the conversation going, or really try to overcome the objection and resolve their concern that you're too expensive. A similar objection, but it's slightly different, is you're more expensive, or I'm leaning toward the other provider. So think of this as in a competitive landscape. They have a lower price from a competitor. Well, the building block that I recommend you might want to use to try to overcome this is your product building block. And if you've used our approach to organize your thoughts here, you hopefully have organized some ways that you're different and some important facts about your company. And this would be the best way to respond to that. So if they say you're more expensive and I'm leaning towards the other guy, okay, well, just so you know, if you're not aware already, some ways we differ from them is that we only work with accountants, we use AI, we guarantee results. Do you know how your other options compare in that area? You could also respond to those same objections with your name drop examples. So they say you're more expensive. I understand. Real quick, a customer that we worked with was an accounting firm, and then you share your name drop example. If we could help you in that same way, would that change how you view us compared to your other options? Maybe that name drop example, that story there that you tell, paints a different picture or helps them to understand why it might be better to spend more money with you instead of you just dropping your price. So just a few responses for overcoming objections that you can use your building blocks for. Like I said, there's probably a lot of objections that are specific to you that those responses don't help with. So what I'd like to give you here is a process you could use for creating your own responses. So step one is when you get an objection that you want to try to overcome, try to get to the root, try to find out that the key thing that the prospect is worried about. Then try to capture the full picture. Then you present your case. And step four is to identify if it's a showstopper. I mean, if the prospect has a deal breaker and you can't do anything about it, you can't overcome it, you definitely want to get out and walk away as soon as possible. So don't continue with some sort of objection that's a deal breaker through the sales process, wasting more time for you and the prospect. So let me give you an example of what this can look like. So let's say that the prospect says you're too expensive and you want to try to overcome that. Well, let's get to the root of that. So if you ask some questions, you can identify that it's not that you're too expensive, it's that the prospect only has $50K left in their budget and your product is $100K. Then the next step was to get the full picture. So when you ask more details about the other things going on in the area where you have something to sell, you might identify that, oh, you know what? They're spending $80K on their existing product, so we are $20K more than them. So we are more expensive, but with the other product, they're spending $60K on labor. And with our product, it's all automated. They wouldn't need to spend that $60K. So then step three is to present your case. The total cost of ownership with us is $40K less. Yes, our product is more expensive than what they're using today, and it's more expensive than the budget they have available. So it might be a deal breaker showstopper, but we can present our case that we're actually $40K less because of the labor savings. And step four is to identify if it's a showstopper. And so we can ask questions around, we can eliminate $60K in labor costs. Is reducing labor an option for you? Maybe it's not. Maybe they're locked into those people with contracts and they can't get rid of them, but maybe they can. Maybe they can move them to a different team and have those savings. And then with you, you're actually cheaper. You're less expensive. So that's an example of using that four-step process to try to overcome an objection. All right, let's wrap up with a few objection handling best practices. The first one is to use a tool that we call an objections map. Very simple here. 2 columns. One column on the left is the objections that you can anticipate. The column on the right is a response for each objection. What you can do here is you can list out all of the objections that you can anticipate. Likely the ones that we've outlined here today are probably 70% of the list. You might want to add objections to that list that are specific for your product, your service, your industry, and then put responses for how you can respond to those in the second column. Just creating this tool might improve your ability to be more prepared for objection handling. When a call ends, stop and think about what objections did that prospect have. objections are likely to come up on almost every call attempt where you end up on the phone call with a prospect or a gatekeeper. So literally after every call, you'll likely have something to reflect back on and think about what objections did the prospect have. Then stop to think about how did you respond to that objection? Was what you said effective at your goal of keeping the call going? If it wasn't, you might want to think about what could you have said differently to have a better result, to get the call going, to get more information. What questions could you have asked to keep the call going or gather more information? So when you're reflecting back, that's a great time to think about what questions did I ask? What questions could I have asked and maybe get more information or have a better result? And then after you go through this sort of mental process, it is a good time for you to update the objections map that we just talked about. So if you think about a different way you could have responded, add that to the objection response. You might identify the objection that you faced isn't even on your objections map. So add it to the objections map. So that could be a living, breathing document. And like I said, just working on that document to edit it and to build it can make you more prepared by itself. All right, so a few key takeaways here. One key thing for improving your objection handling abilities is to minimize how much you sound like a salesperson that's trying to sell something. This will decrease the number of objections that you have to face, which is a good thing to do. Sell the meeting, not the product. When you really fully embrace that in the front of your mind, that will impact and improve your responses that you say for objections. Deflect the objections when you're in the initial contact step. Improve your level of preparation with an objections map. And that is pretty much it. The next training module, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about gatekeepers. And gatekeepers is kind of related to objections because a lot of what you're going to face when you're dealing with gatekeepers is gatekeepers trying to get rid of you, blocking you out, giving you objections. And we'll talk about how to deal with all of that in the next training module. And we look forward to seeing you there. If you got at least one tip out of this video and you want to return the favor, very easy for you to do. Simply like, comment, share this video, subscribe to our channel. Any or all of those help us tremendously. And none of those cost you anything. If you like our tips, you may want to follow us on any or all of these social platforms. We post daily sales tips on these every day. If you like this and you want more of this, everything I've shown you here today is part of the SMART sales system. SMART stands for sales messaging and response tactics. Our key belief is that we make salespeople better by giving them the most powerful, clear to understand sales message, the most attention grabbing sales message. And you can see here today that we can use that sales message that we help you to create for all of your objection responses, or the majority of them. And the response in SMART is clearly what we talked about here today: how to respond to objections, how to respond to the prospect in certain situations. And as you can see, what I've shown you here today is very clear tactics. Do this, don't do that. So there's not a lot of fluff in this training program. Now, we call it a system because it's a 3-level system that you can actually implement in your sales processes, in your brain, in your approach. And the foundation of the SMART sales system is to create a good, clear sales message. As you can see, what we talked about here today, as you can see, all the objection responses we gave you here today built off of that sales message. And that takes us to level 2, which is we can use that sales message to create a bunch of different documents. One of those documents being an objections map. We can use your sales message to create your objections map that I mentioned you should create. And once you have all those sales tools, then it's all about execution. And that's the level 3 of the SMART sales system. So you can see there's a module in level 3 for objection handling. That's what we just did here today. So that was part of the level 3 of how to get around objections, how to respond to objections, how to create your objection responses. Now, if you want to access the full SMART sales system, the great news is you can do it all for free because it's all on YouTube. You can go to this playlist, the SMART sales system, sell smarter, not harder. And there is a training module for every step of the SMART sales system. And the reason why we give away our sales training on YouTube for free is because it all aligns with a product that we sell called Sales Scripter. For example, level 1 of the SMART sales system is to create your sales message. There is an area of Sales Scripter called the Sales Message Builder that will take you through that process to create your message step by step and make creating your sales message easier. And then there's an area of Sales Scripter that aligns with level 2 called the Sales Playbook, which is a library of documents, email templates, cold call scripts. There's an objections map here. And all of these documents fill in with your sales message. So it's very efficient. Once you create your sales message, voila, you have a whole library of documents here, an entire Sales Playbook. And then Sales Scripter can help you with level 3 as well, with email automation, full functioning CRM, help you with cold calling, objection handling, lead scoring, and whatnot. And the upgrade from there is certainly I'm available for consulting hours to help you with any of those levels. I help clients to create their sales message, create their scripts, create their objection responses, create their email templates, help them with execution as well. If that's interesting, but you still don't know what to do next, you could check out my book called The Smart Sales System. You can get a copy on Amazon here, Sell Smarter, Not Harder. That's pretty much it. Hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, the best place for you to go is salescriptor.com. There are more tips, there are more videos, there are free ebooks that you can sign up for and download. If you have questions on the SalesScriptor software and product, there's plenty of product information. There is a chat window that you can use to chat with us and ask questions. And that's pretty much it. Hope this was helpful. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.